Please welcome to the stage Dr. Hamsa Fran Ayala Sama Yajula.
Okay, we're going to check the mic real quick, I think. All right, great, I'm on. Thank you. I'm going to set my timer real quickly. Wow, he did an awesome job with my name. Thank you for that, Dick. We practiced a little bit beforehand, so I think he did really well. What an awesome convention we're having. I'm so blessed to be here and be amongst such beautiful people. Thank you all so much, and give yourselves a round of applause for a great start to our second day. Now for the biggest trick here, because we didn't get all of this rehearsed, so I think we're going to, thank you, get our slides up and running. I will be talking to you today about the spiritual principles within business success, and I think that this is a really important topic. We oftentimes try to figure out how do we go about and getting the word out in terms of what we're doing, whether it's in a ministry, if that's how you are applying your practice, or perhaps you are in some other form of profession or application of our metaphysics. And sometimes people struggle with that. And there are elements, undoubtedly, that are very much metaphysical, everything is, but there are also some really simplistic, basic components that we should really take a look at. And so we're going to do that today. I know when I met Dr. Masters back, I think the first time was in 2006, that was a thing that was one point of which, amongst many, that attracted us to one another, was that he understood and really pressed upon everyone within this field to apply the principles of business to be successful in what you're doing. And so today I really want to emphasize those aspects. So this is not my machine, so I'm going to need just a moment to orient myself. I think I've got it down though. So what I really want to talk about is something that goes beyond many of the points that we all kind of know, right? We all talk about having a vision. If you could just visualize it in your mind, see the outcome that you want to create. And then on the opposite end, there are those folks who tell us, have a plan. Do you have a plan? Put a business plan in place. Write down some goals and objectives. These are all, they're not necessarily easy, but they're the basics, right? They're the things that we kind of all know and sort of, I would hope, are beginning to do. And if you haven't done that, so then certainly afterwards we can talk about that, because there's some really simple ways to go about that. But what I really want to do is step beyond that a little bit and talk about some of the challenges that we face as practitioners. And if you're not full-time into your role as a practitioner, a metaphysics practitioner, then however it is you go about generating your income. So from that perspective, one of the things that we really need to look at are what are the impediments, the things that are holding us back. And in many respects, we have a tendency to look outside of ourselves as being the point of challenge that we're facing, when in reality, when we look at it from a metaphysical, or in my case, a yogic perspective, then what we find that there are actually 9 natural impediments that are out there that we face, are challenged with. And when we reflect upon them, examples of those being are doubt, or laziness, or even inconsistency. We start something, we're doing really well, and then we don't follow through. These are all things that have to do with ourselves internally. What I love about this particular slide is that and many of you might recognize Sri Ganesha, right? He is the god or removal of obstacles. But in reality, those obstacles that he's removing are not outside of ourselves. They're actually within ourselves. And so when you look at this list, which unfortunately today we won't have time to go into great detail on, you'll nonetheless see how these impediments, these obstacles, are obstacles that we can control within ourselves. And as metaphysics practitioners, certainly, what are some of the first things that we can do to manage these? So we want to shout out one thing you might be able to do. You can meditate. But let's go a little deeper. Why then are we meditating? We're meditating as a point to control our mind, to silence the chatter that's in our mind. Why silence the chatter within our mind? We silence the chatter within our mind because those are the points of Maya, of illusion. And if we can begin to eliminate those, silence them, then we can actually be in the present moment and be able to take a course of action that is intelligent, and it's intelligence based on the realism of what's really going on in our world and in the world around us and within ourselves, so that we have good discernment, good judgment in the steps that we take. The other aspect or approach that one can take along this is also to replace our thoughts. Now, we all heard from a physics perspective the concept of no two objects can occupy the same space. I go one step beyond that. No two thoughts can occupy the same space. That's why we go through this process of replacing our negative thought, our thoughts that don't serve us. Those are what we consider negative, right? No good, no bad. But whatever's not serving us, we replace it. We replace it with something that creates for that desirable state. And doing that such that, again, no two thoughts can occupy the same space. So if you're in a place of fear, replacing those words that are putting forth a vibration of fear with something that's positive. I'm going to switch a little bit as we move into the second principle and start off with a little story. So this photo is a photo of my grandfather and my father. My grandfather is a spry 97-year-old, and he's on the left, and then there's my dad on the right. Two phenomenal men in my life. And I share this in particular because my grandfather had only a third grade education, and yet he was a farmer and a very successful farmer. And he was so good at what he did that he was able to put through school his 10 children. All 10 kids went through college. And then in turn, my dad went on to put all of his 5 kids through college. And I look upon my family and I'm like, wow, they're all everybody's really successful. They're all doing really well. And one day we're riding along in the car and I said, Dad, I've got this message that's coming from in my meditation about this concept of 6 things. And I couldn't really figure it out, but there was these 6 things that make a difference in the way that we do stuff. And I started thinking, something just told me, it's got to be, go back to the roots, and roots are farmland. So I figured, let me start asking about, farming. What is it about farming? And so I looked at these steps in farming. These 6 came out to be 6 steps, and we're going to go into each one by one here. But what I found, and what this turned into at the end of it, was a concept around detachment. We often talk about being detached, right? Don't hold tight to the outcome. But yet it's kind of this challenge there, because if you think about it, it's well, okay, you're not supposed to be holding on to the outcome, but yet you're supposed to do your darndest, right? Give it your all, give it your best. How do you do that and at the same time not be attached to it? So I took these principles that I learned from my father and from my grandfather, and I applied them to this notion of the second principle of being determination. And the first was around tilling. And my dad says, well, Fran, you gotta till the soil. You gotta break stuff up, loosen it up, create some space, start to kind of get it ready to utilize. And so essentially that's where we go in the first component of this, learning to be determined, right? Determination versus attachment. We do our part, and that first part is the tilling of the soil. And then we move beyond that. We move to our second space where we sort of are preparing the bedding. And this is kind of creating additional space, the invitation to come in. So how do I look at this? Well, I look at it sort of like when someone has, as an example, a ministry, and they're trying to bring people in, trying to grow your congregation, right? Grow your family. How do you do that? How do you create this inviting space? You've got to break it up, be willing to let go, right? You're tilling and you've dug up all those stones that aren't serving and broken up those weeds, creating new space. There's some stuff that we hold on to that just doesn't work for us. Doesn't work for our practice. Doesn't work for our retail store. Recognize what those things are. Study them, research them, remove them and create new space, and then make that invitation to draw new people in. Right? Opening it up, creating room. And once we've done that, once we've sort of created this space, this bedding, and planted our seeds, there's an observation period. Now, sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes you've got all the perfect conditions, whether we call it luck or no luck. Whatever it is, it's right. Things are ripe, and it's just going to grow on its own. And there are some good examples of crops, which I'm not good at, but I think cotton might be one. I don't know, some other like corn, where if the conditions are just right, it's just going to grow anyway. There's some things, nettle as an example, which is kind of considered a weed. It kind of just grows. The conditions are right, and it just grows on its own. But in other instances, it's not right. So you have to go through this assessment period and study. Become familiar with your customer or your audience. Millennials often become the challenge for those who have ministries, as an example. How do we bring them in? How do we create things that are relevant for them, right? Begin to study what is relevant to them, what is of interest to them, what is part of their pop culture, and incorporate components of that which can serve you well in inviting them into your ministry. If you're a practitioner, leveraging language that resonates with the audience that you're working with the customers that you're working with. So then, we've gone through this assessment period. We're preparing ourselves to make this transition. And one of the things that we oftentimes tend to do is then we want to let everybody know about everything that we know. And I call this sort of the irrigation period, because one of the things you're going to have to do is give some water. Now, if you got the perfect terrain and it's watering on its own, fine. But when you're irrigating, do you just take a hose and or a bucket and throw all your water at once onto your plant? No, you'll flood it out, right? Instead, you kind of sprinkle. You give sprinkles of it. Give sprinkles of your knowledge over time in smaller bits and chunks and sizes that people can understand. Because for us, it's like, oh, we've got it. But for others, they don't necessarily have it. So breaking it up into bite-sized pieces, and again, applying it to your audience in ways that resonate with your audience. These are all simple things, but they're important things nonetheless that we need to be able to do. The fifth one is to fertilize, and this one I find kind of interesting because, okay, you've got to fertilize the soil. You've observed it, water wasn't enough, you've got to fertilize the soil now. How do you go about doing this from an application perspective when it comes to business principles? Sometimes we're know-it-alls. We had all that knowledge and we're sharing all our knowledge and we know everything about what we need to do and we're just going to do it our way. And we continue to do it our way, and yet to our continued frustration, things just don't happen the way we want them to happen. I think somebody said maybe the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Einstein, right? So essentially, here's an opportunity to incorporate within your businesses the thoughts and creative concepts of those that you're trying to serve. So as new folks are coming to you, applying some of the knowledge and creativeness that they have, and in turn, what you're creating in essence is an environment that reflects not only yourself, but those around you, and as a result, they feel more what? More inclusive. You create parity, inclusion, and representation that might be absent otherwise. So these are all, some things to kind of consider and play around with. The last and sixth component within this second principle of determination is that while you've done all these things, you still have to cultivate. I give the example of the plant, of the tree rather, a little tree. You put a little fence around the tree, because if you don't put a fence around the tree, what's going to happen? The deer is going to come and eat your little beautiful tree, right? You got to protect it, cultivate it. We say, herbicide is an example, right? Or there are natural pesticides that are out there too. All these things we do to protect our plant. And so those are things that you should consider in your businesses as well, is to protect and cultivate the business that you're growing. So you might be wondering, well, Fran, why did you put, and I don't have another slide to principle 2, but you might be wondering, well, Fran, why did you put all of this stuff around, farming under this concept of determination and determination versus attachment? And that's because at some point you have to get to a point of samtosha, which is our third principle. Samtosha is a Sanskrit word which really just means contentment. And you can reach a point of being content when you've said you've given it your all, you've given it your best. So, saying on one end, I'm attached to my outcomes. No, don't be attached to your outcomes. Be determined and say at the end that I've done all of these steps. I've understood my market, I studied my market, I incorporated the thoughts and the ideas of the customers or the people that I serve. I've taken the time to really flesh out what's working and what's serving and what's not serving. So really being able to say to yourself, I've given it all of this, and be satisfied with that, like a farmer. Sometimes the crop just doesn't grow. But the interesting thing about a farmer is a farmer has multiple seeds, and they look for the best amongst those seeds. So essentially, you try one set of seeds, and you cultivate those, you take them through that whole process, and then you start another set. You continue on, but you give it your best, nonetheless. You give it your best. And I like this particular picture, which I'm not sure if you recognize or not, but the concept is around Arjuna, and the idea is that you have to be fully present. You've got to show up. You need to respond to the ability that you're able to respond. And these are all aspects of what one will ultimately be able to say that they've done when they reach that space of santosha, that space of contentment, that I've given it my all. Because the real agitation, the real frustration, when you haven't accomplished what you set out to accomplish, is because hidden within ourselves, we know there's certain things that we might have been able to do a little differently, a little better, where we may not have shown up, where we might not have been fully present. So these are the things that I'd like for you to consider. One last point on here is just, it says Nati, Nati, Nati. You might be wondering, well, what is this? We say, you're not that thing that you're trying to create. And you're not that other thing. And you're not your thoughts. You're more than that. And you have the ability within yourself to create many things. But it all begins in your mind. And the representation of Arjuna also illustrates that. It just represents our ability to create the outcomes that we want that serve ourselves and serve others. And we do that in ways by the application of these three principles. So I'd really like to thank you all for your time today. I have 2 minutes remaining, and I always like to leave a little bit of time for the audience to ask questions. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? No questions? Then I think someone raised their hand in the back? Yeah. It's Sanskrit. It means not this, neti, not this, not that. Not this, not that. It means no, not, is basically what it means. Yep.
Where do you get the seeds?
I'm sorry?
Where do you get the seeds?
Well, that's good that you asked that. I've got like 30, 60 seconds. I'll use it in this time. It was really interesting yesterday as people were talking a lot about creation. And for me, and perhaps for some others, the smallest element in the universe is actually prana. Prana is not just a life form, it is life force. It is the smallest element. It is smaller than a hadron, which is smaller. There's a neutrons are smaller than a neutron, smaller than a hadron, smaller than a quark is prana. And that prana is actually what makes everything within the universe function, including our thoughts. And so where we draw our attention, we are drawing energy. And the result of that energy can create itself, manifest itself in multiple forms, both animate and inanimate. And those are our seeds. Great question. Great question. Namaste. Thank you.